4th of May, 2004. We're in the home of Bill and Mary Markle in Randolph, Vermont. And we'll begin with Bill. I'd like you to start, if you might, by just talking a little bit about where you were born and about your parents and grandparents, your family background, a little bit of that. I can hold that if you like.
Oh, let's see. I was born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1920. As a matter of fact, I've got my 84th birthday coming up, 84th birthday coming up, 1920, June 12th. Anyway, I was born in New Haven to my father, who had actually been born in Europe and Russia, and had been brought to this country as a little boy in the early 1900s. And my mother was born actually in the United States. So I was, in effect, first generation on my father's side in this country. I spent my early years in New Haven, Connecticut, and stayed there until I completed my education at Yale University in 1941. And then I had a very close relationship with my maternal grandparents. As a matter of fact, my father died when I was about 7 years old, and a little before I was 7. And so my mother closed up their home and moved back into her father's home, and brought me along with her. So I spent the next time until I was about 17 living in my grandfather's home in a 3-generation family with my mother. And shortly, about 8 months after my father died, my only sibling was born, my brother. And so we all lived in this multi-generational family, which was a Orthodox, very Orthodox family. And my grandfather, who was sort of my role model after my father died, was very active in Jewish community life. He had helped build one of the early Orthodox synagogues in New Haven, Connecticut in the late 1800s. And he was president of this congregation for something like, I don't know, for about 20 years, and was active in a whole variety of Jewish activities. He spent many years on the board of the Jewish Home for the Aged in New Haven, and was greatly involved in helping people who came to this country get settled and so on, and just frequently happened in those undertakings. My grandparents even brought my grandmother's, was it my grandfather? I guess my grandfather's late sister's daughter, and after she died, her husband, who was a rabbi, couldn't feel competent to raise a girl, so my grandparents brought her in and raised her and had her live with us until they arranged. She completed her education and college education, and then arranged for her marriage and so forth. So it was a really activist grandfather whose home I was raised in. And in addition to the fact that he was a very successful businessman and So it was an interesting childhood that I had.
Did New Haven have sort of a Jewish or Jewish neighborhoods to speak of? I'll hold it because I can. It's easier for me
Okay.
to regulate.
Jewish neighborhoods.
Definitely.
It did have a Jewish, what you would call a Jewish ghetto, and in part of New Haven, so-called Oak Street area, where the kosher delicatessen and the butchers and so forth, the bakers and people went down to buy their bread and so on and so forth. So there was that area, although my grandfather did not long live in that area. He moved out of that area fairly early on, and it was not specifically Jewish neighborhood. I don't know if that answers the question. or not.
Yeah. Now, you said that your mother had been born in this country.
In this country.
Where had her?
She had been born in New Haven.
Uh-huh.
When my grandfather and my grandmother came to this country, my maternal grandmother and grandmother came to this country, they settled, they got married in Europe, came to this country in their honeymoon. They weren't ever going to go back.
17 and 19 or something, 17 and 18
Yeah.
years old.
They were really young. My grandfather was about 17 or 18, and my grandmother was, I think, a year older than he was. And so they left with their suitcases and without any knowledge of the English language, and found their way to. My grandfather didn't really want to serve in the Tsar's army. I mean, in those days, that was the. If you hung around Russia, you wouldn't have that privilege of spending a lot of time in the Tsar's army.
Yeah, and I think the Jews in particular.
Particularly the Jews.
Put them in the army, and then they would keep them there.
They would keep for a long time, right? And so he decided that wasn't a good thing to do. So he left early on, and so shortly after they arrived in New Haven, their family started to come along, and they had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and my mother was number 1.
You think?
I believe she was either number 1 or number 2. People were very cozy about keeping track of their ages, but anyway, so she was born there, and my father's family settled in New Haven. His father was got into the plumbing contracting business in this country, and so that was what happened.
That's your maternal grandmother.
Yeah, this was my maternal grandfather, Harris Kasdan, and that was my paternal grandfather, Nathan Markle.
Oh, he was
He-
in the Russian army.
That's
He was in the Russian army,
Yeah.
in the transportation corps. My paternal grandfather was.
Well, actually, my next question was going to be, as you were growing up, I wanted to know what you heard from grandparents about Russia. You know, what sorts of stories did they tell you?
They were really not very interested in discussing what life was like over there, and as a matter of fact, my grandfather was very interested in getting as many members of his wife's family out of the country as he could, and helping them get settled in New Haven also. And I got to meet some of those people, and obviously they had come out of very traumatic circumstances. It had not been an easy life for them. They were almost afraid to answer a door, and were very withdrawn. And just concerned about talking about anything, because of the environment that they had come out of.
And now you say that the family's observance was Orthodox. So what would, for you as a child growing up, what would that entail? I mean, what kinds of practices?
Okay. The home I was raised in was a strictly kosher home. They observed the Sabbath. You weren't supposed to write and there was, my grandfather would take me to the synagogue on Saturday morning. I would walk with him. It was about a mile from the synagogue. And I was involved there. On the other hand, it was very interesting. When it came to the decision as to where I would get my Jewish education, it was multifaceted in that I was enrolled at an early age in a Reform Jewish Sunday school. And my grandfather enrolled me in that school himself and paid for whatever the cost was to have me there, even though he wasn't a member of that congregation. And I asked him, why I was going there, because that had nothing to do with the synagogue I went to. And he said, "You will get a better Jewish education here." It's a better school, and you may learn some different things, but you'll get a better education here. So I did almost from the first grade until I was actually confirmed in that Reformed temple. Although I had my bar mitzvah, I was also trained for my bar mitzvah at home with a private instructor who came 3 times a week.
So the bar mitzvah was not really tied into that?
It wasn't tied
Sunday
into that because they didn't,
Yeah.
in those days they didn't even have bar mitzvahs. Everybody was confirmed when you finished your high school. But I had my bar mitzvah in the synagogue my grandfather and mother decided it would be in the synagogue of the Jewish Home for the Aged. So I had an interesting bar mitzvah in that the synagogue was full of very old people, and it was an event that they didn't have happen there very often because my grandfather was a member of the board of it was arranged, and there I was doing my bar mitzvah stuff in the synagogue of the Jewish Home for the Aged.
Now here's a funny question for you. My daughter's 12, and so she's getting ready for her bat mitzvah next year. So I'm thinking about these things. Do you remember what your Torah portion was? Do you remember?
It's funny.
It's one of these things that you're supposed to remember.
Yeah, right. I can't tell you whether it's the same one that I did last year on my 83rd birthday in a instant replay of my bar mitzvah since I was eligible at the 70 years. This was something that happened at Beth Jacobs Synagogue. My wife couldn't resist having it commemorated.
But we know Peggy.
Yeah,
right.
But the thing is,
It was.
He did, we think he did the same piece that he
Yeah.
did a long time ago, and Toby
I,
told him
I
it was
think
exactly
I
what
think
he did.
I think it was the same one.
Yeah. So
it
what-
was
what-
it was Numbers chapter.
Is that written on there?
It's written. It's not written on here,
No.
but as a matter of fact, I still got the tape that I practiced on. It's Numbers
I
4
can get you that
chapter.
info, I've got it.
Mary's got it written
Yeah.
down.
Well, that's good. That's I
My-
didn't realize that people do. You know, that years and years later you might.
Yeah, I did an instant replay at my 70th birthday, which was 70 years after I did my. So at 83,
Yeah.
it's appropriate to redo your bar mitzvah.
Huh. Well, I'll tell my.
But
daughter about that.
I think it was the same one.
Yeah.
My recollection is.
Now, in New Haven, did you attend? In the public school, did you attend a school that was fairly mixed?
Oh yes, a high school. Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, junior high school,
So-
high school, grammar school.
And so Jews and non-Jews.
Oh yeah,
were
oh yeah, yeah.
very assimilated there.
Right. Absolutely. And I stayed there, as I say, till I graduated. I stayed in that community till 1941, and left to start my business undertakings for a couple of years, and then I was in World War II for a little less than 5 years. Started as an enlisted man, became an officer, and that's where I met that lady.
So, and did you serve overseas?
I was headed overseas when the war ended. I was on my way out in the Pacific, and we stopped in Honolulu to drop some people off and go on the island hopping program. But the atom bombs had been dropped while we were actually at sea, and the Japanese threw in the towel, so everything stopped, and I ended up staying in Hawaii. That was as far as I got. I was with the, I was in the Army Air Corps, but then that became the Army Air Force, so that was what I did.
Here, Numbers chapter 4, verses 21 through
37, right?
Thanks. Now, just back for a moment, I don't know my history well enough to know what, for example, going to Yale University, was that before or after they had these quotas?
Oh, when I went, there were quotas.
Uh-huh.
1937. No, but there were no acknowledged quotas, but everybody knew that Jews were not going to be over 10% of the student body.
You were
And-
a townie, too.
Huh?
You were a townie. You lived
Yeah, well, I lived in New Haven, but
But your uncle had been there.
the reason I really went to Yale was because I had 4 uncles who graduated from there, and 3 of them had also graduated from the Yale Law School. So whatever the reason that I got in there, I got in, and it was, but it was acknowledged pretty much. There weren't that many Jewish students in my class. I mean, the whole entry class was 900, so it was something probably a little under 90 who, nobody touted the fact that they were Jewish. There was no Hillel or it was a WASP culture at Yale. And
And you just have to do your best to adapt to it or
Yeah, I mean,
live with it.
yeah, I mean, when my uncle went there, he was class of 26 at Yale, attendance of chapel was required. And that wasn't a Jewish service.
It's not.
But, I don't know, we all survived it, got a good education. And, with the passage of time, I find that I was fortunate to be accepted there and to graduate from there. And I've kept some of my friends. We begin to wind down. Our classes are thinning out. I think I have still about 200 living classmates, but Yale has changed from that point of view now. There are no quotas, and that was a good thing. And it really got changed after World War II.
Now, there's a big, I understand there's a big chunk of time, you left New Haven at 41, but you didn't come to Vermont. I mean, you lived your life
I was out in the Midwest.
New Haven first, then you came back for the service. New Haven.
Oh, well, what happened was I graduated, worked in New Jersey, was in the service for almost 5 years. Then my grandfather wanted me to come back to New Haven and join a family business, which family owned. And so I did that and worked in New Haven from about 47 until early in 52. Then I moved out to the Midwest, joined another company out there, and stayed in the Midwest except for a year or so when I was president of a company out in California. And spent the rest of my time as an executive in the Midwest before I started my own business around my 50th birthday, and then ran my own businesses until I was about 75 years old. So I always felt I was a hired gun executive, and I worked at that till I was 50, and then through a series of interesting circumstances, I ended up owning my own business, and so I ran the last 25 years owning my own business and buying businesses and selling businesses and so on. So that was why I finished up, and finally 1987, 90, maybe say no, longer than that. 95 I sold my last business and was officially retired.
And what kind of businesses were you?
I was in the recycling business. A big chunk of my time was in the aluminum business, aluminum recycling, operating and or owning and operating aluminum smelting companies which bought aluminum scrap and processed it, produced casting alloys for the foundry industry. The businesses that I was involved with were heavily involved in supplying major consumers of aluminum such as Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And we had, at one stage of the game, my partners and I had the largest recycling company of that type in the country, if not in the world.
So you did that for several decades, and then somehow or other you ended up coming here. That's the next question, is how you ended up.
How did I end up at Randolph, Vermont?
How did that happen?
I had a daughter who was living in Bethel, Vermont, and she had worked with me out in the Midwest and decided that she wanted to live in Vermont. So she left our company, which she was an employee of, and came up here. And I had a chore I wanted. She was working in completely different business. She was making wood-burning stoves up here in this town for a company called Vermont Castings. And she had an executive job with them. And I called her up. I said, I got this chore for you to help me with. And when can I have a day or time? So I came up and spent a day with her, and we'd worked all day. And she said, I got to take a break. I've got to do some laundry. I said, okay, I'll go with you. Where are you going? She said, I'm going to Randolph, Vermont, which was the next town over. So we got here to Randolph, and she said, I'm going to be doing my laundry for an hour. What are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I'll walk around, something to keep me busy. So I said, I'll see you back here in an hour. And I looked around and had an hour to kill. And I saw a sign, realtor. So I figured it was a good way to kill an hour, you know. So I started this conversation with this very suspicious salesman who thought I was really BSing and asking about real estate. And he was pretty sure I was wasting his time. And finally, I got him to put me in his car and start showing me some property. So this was the third place he showed me.
Is she still doing her laundry all this time?
Yeah, no, the meter was running. And so I saw this house and I really liked it. And I called Mary up in Chicago and she said, where are you? I said, I'm visiting Penelope up in Vermont. I said, I saw a house up here. And what would you think if I bought it? She said, for what? Well, kids are here in this part of the country. She said, where's this house? And I told her. Oh, she says, I know exactly where you were. I guess she'd been up here with our daughter when she visited her. Anyway, so we went back to this guy's office. And I said, okay, here's my offer, because he had told me what the guy wanted. And I said, I had a blank check with me, and I wrote an earnest money. I said, let me know how it comes out. Here are my terms and so on. And I said, I got to get back to meet my daughter. I got back exactly 1 hour. And then two or 3 weeks later, we actually got an acceptance on our offer. And so then we owned this house. It was in the, late 70s?
79.
Yeah, and I'd made a promise to Mary that I was really going to retire. And, but other things got in the way. But she said, well, I don't know what you're going to do. I'm moving to Vermont. Because we were living on a mini farm outside of Chicago. And anyway, so she moved up here in 81, and our son took over our home out in Chicago when he came to work for us. And I spent 5 years commuting up here or something. Funny, 5 years I told my partners I wouldn't commute anymore. And so I worked from up here. I had an office up here.
You say outside of Chicago, you lived on a mini
farm.
farm. Yeah, tell me about that.
My
It was Mary's farm. It was
So I'll follow up. I'll ask you about that later too.
yeah, it was a place that we had bought. We lived in sort of a fancy neighborhood, and there was sort of a funny story connected with it, because Mary's an organic gardener, and we lived in this very nice home on a corner of a street and so on. And one day I got home and she was really unhappy. She said, do you know what happened to me today? And I said, what happened? She said, a policeman came to my door and said they'd had a complaint about me. I said, about what? They said, people in the area said I was burying garbage on our property. And I explained to the policeman that I was not burying garbage on the property. I was an organic gardener, and I took the fresh potato peelings, whatever it is, and I was putting them in around my plants,
It was a garden.
It was a garden or whatever it was. So he said to her, well, I understand, Mrs. Markle, but could you do it at night so nobody could see what's happening? And when I got home that day, she said, we're moving out of here. I said, where are we going? She said, I don't know, but we're leaving here.
So,
She found us a farm to live on where she could do her organic gardening.
so that was, I mean, that sounds like that was a factor then in coming here, was wanting to be living someplace where there was land. That,
Oh, we
your
had
neighbors aren't going to
no, we had enough land. We had, what do we have, about
5 acres.
we had about 5 acres. It was all fenced in. We had our gardens. We had our animals. She was raising turkeys and goats, and she had a pony. And but we had a lot of fun. Our kids were phasing out, leaving home.
All except for John.
Yeah, John, our youngest, was the only one who was still at home. So, anyway, so that's the story.
Now, once you were up here, did you have any self-consciousness about being, I guess, not just an urban person, but a Jewish person living in a place like Vermont? Did that?
It was interesting. We weren't sure when we were up here first, early on, that outside of our door there were any Jewish people in the area. I mean, there was a synagogue up in Burlington. I'm sorry, Montpelier. Yeah, and but there didn't seem to be any recognizable Jewish people. There was an attorney in town whose name was Burstein, so we figured Dick was Jewish, but not many other Jewish names floating around. But anyway, I think it was the first year up here or second year, Mary, you decided that we would get the word out that we were going to have a Seder here. Was that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we may have been working with the church.
No, that was before that. Anyway, we got the word out that we were having a Seder here. If there were any Jewish people in the area that were interested, they'd call us, and that they would be welcome to come for a Seder. And we were surprised how many people. We squeezed them into this house, but they came, and it was the beginning of finding out there were quite a few Jewish people. They were sort of hiding out here, A lot of people had come up to Vermont. There were a lot of people with mixed marriages up here and so forth. And slowly, I mean, that was, but generally speaking, we felt very comfortable in the community. And since Mary was spending a lot more time up here in the early stages than I was, she had a lot of good friends. And
We were part of the Montpelier community.
yeah, we were also part of it.
Part of it. We belonged to Beth Jacob. We had not belonged. We had dropped our membership in Reformed congregations at that point for a couple of years anyway. Not many, but a couple.
Mm-hmm. You mean from before when you?
Yeah,
we
were very active in Reformed congregations. And
I've been a congregational president
for 7 years.
for 7 years out in Illinois. So, but it was different up here.
So some of these people who you describe as sort of hiding out, I mean, what kinds of stories occur to you?
Oh, one day we got a call from a minister friend of ours in the town of Rochester. What was his name, Murray? Jim Proctor.
No, but he's in South London. I'll have to look.
Anyway,
but I can-
we got a call from this guy who was running the church over there. He called up, and we got to know him, or he got to know us. He called up, he said, Bill, he says, I thought I would let you know that in our community there are 13 families with at least one Jewish spouse, but only one of those has two. He said, you might, because Mary had in the process of thinking about organizing some sort of a Havurah in the area, just so we get some sort of a word out where Jewish people would sort of come together. And that was an interesting call to get from the minister over there because he knew what we were doing. And we had started another program. We had a Reform rabbi in Illinois who's since died, but was a long friend of ours. We've been in his congregation for how many years out there, Mariana?
52 on or
From
whatever.
1952 on.
Mm-hmm.
And even when we left, we maintained our membership in the congregation. And we arranged to bring him up here for 5 days at a time, at least twice. Originally it was twice a year, that he would come up and conduct services up at Beth Jacob, and would also meet with the ministers in the area. We'd have arranged a all-day affair, if the ministers wanted it, to meet with a rabbi and spend a day with a rabbi. One year he taught them Hebrew, and he developed he did it over a period of about 15 or 16 years.
Really?
Yeah, 15 years, I think. And so we got, but because of the fact that he was here, we became increasingly involved with church activities in the community, and were called upon from time to time to present Jewish views of things. One time I was asked if I would do a Seder at a local church here, United Church of Christ. They asked me if I would conduct a service as if I was doing it in my own home. And so I talked to a rabbi friend out in Illinois, and he sent us a bunch of old Reform Haggadahs, and we did it was really quite amazing. The thing sold out. They couldn't take any more reservations. The first night Seder, I did the first night Seder with. And so they turned around, 20 people away or something. So quick in a hurry, we arranged to do a second night Seder, not here. We had no room for it, although we were going to do it. We took over a local restaurant in town and did a Seder in town for about 40 or 50 people. We invited the people who couldn't get into the one in town to be our
It's
guests.
very popular. I just did what you're describing. I was asked by a friend of ours who's a Unitarian minister to do the same
Right,
at the Unitarian Church in
Right.
Greenfield
Right.
just this past
Right.
Passover. And I think in that church, too, I think they schedule 3 or 4 Seders
yeah.
to accommodate all of the...
And they asked me if I would do others. I said, look, you learned how to do the one. I'm giving you the Haggadahs. You figure out what to do them. And but the thing that amazed me about that Seder I did was the emotional impact it seemed to have on the people who attended it. I had people. There were people who were actually in tears in that thing. But it was quite interesting.
Now, has it been your impression, or at least early on, was it your impression that among, for instance, these families with the mixed marriages and so on, do the Jewish people you know in Vermont, did a lot of them come here because they wanted
To
the
escape.
rural lifestyle, to escape from something? Is that...
I had the feeling they'd come up here to hide out. And early on, Mary met some of those interesting people. She met Michael Paley, who was the Hillel rabbi
Yeah,
at
he
Dartmouth.
was a rabbi that he was at Columbia. I mean, you surely heard of Michael, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
He ultimately became
When
the
he
chaplain
first
at
came here,
Columbia
he just
University.
He had just come out from they had a commune here. He was part of the commune here, and he had just left that. They had just disbanded it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But
left. I don't think it's a mix. I think the world is changing.
I think what changed for the people who come over, they started to have children, and that became a factor in drawing them back to something. I mean,
It's like Debbie Freeman said last night, she's a child of the 60s.
50, she said.
She said 60s, you weren't listening.
Okay,
She said
I missed it
60s.
then.
Whatever, peace and love and all this, and she said, I can't get away from that. And that's why the people that were our children's age, that's why they were here. They were searching, I think is what, and I don't know.
They wanted to escape from organized Judaism.
Organization.
They wanted to get away from organized Judaism. That's what has created great difficulty in the congregation up in Montpelier.
But then, as you say, those people have children.
And that gets,
And then that-
yeah,
Religious school is great. Even Montpelier has a great religious school.
but, and bringing a rabbi on board has been worrisome. They've resisted. They finally, this year, bring a rabbi on board at Montpelier.
And what, before a rabbi was brought on, what?
They did the services themselves, and they brought visiting rabbis there,
Yeah.
but they did not have a rabbi of the congregation.
Well, in our temple, there's a spiritual leader,
Yeah.
and he's the second of two, I think. Neither one of them have
Well-
been rabbis.
Well, you're talking about at Greenfield?
Greenfield, yeah.
Lou Reiser was there, right?
He was right, and he was a rabbi. But then, since
then they
Bob
had-
Rottenberg
Yeah.
and currently Ephraim Eisen
Hmm.
are both not ordained.
But you don't, the reason, a rabbi is a teacher, he doesn't have to be somehow the rabbis got to running congregations, which they're not really great at.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also
They're teachers.
like so many things that the influence of the dominant culture in American churches. There's a
Yeah.
pastor or what have you, and so the precedent is set, and Jews want to fit in like everybody else. So they think, well, we have our temples, and we need our temple to have sort of an equivalent of the pastor
Pastor,
or
right.
Mm-hmm.
what have you.
Well, Bill belongs to the congregation his grandfather had in New Haven, and they have a rabbi there. But they have, what does Sidney do? He's not the rabbi, he runs the synagogue.
Yeah, he's the,
He's been there since 41, 42, 45.
50,
Was that it?
what do they call them? Shamus. Shamus runs the show, the Orthodox show.
And the rabbi's a lawyer too. I mean, he's an active lawyer in New Haven, so that's the Orthodox.
Mhm.
Anyway, what other questions?
Yeah, maybe you can talk, I mean, we're sort of on the subject already, maybe you talk a little bit about the conference itself and how that got started. She's the person to talk.
She knows more about that because that was her baby. She worked with Michael Paley when the conference was started. The first one was done down in Hanover, as I recall. And it was then a year or two later ended up at Linden State College. But Mary's been on the board and also dragged me onto the board for most of the years that it's been in existence, although we felt that it should have a paid staff. It was originally an all-volunteer, and I lobbied to bring somebody on as a part-time administrator. And after that was done, then we sort of fell back to just becoming an occasional financial supporter of it when they ran out of money. But recently we were asked to come back on the board, so because there seemed to be some question as to whether it should continue or survive.
Well, times have changed.
So we didn't know whether it had run its
The
course.
computer. We're not so rural anymore. We're connected.
But
Use the damn thing for that.
so we're back on board again, working with them and trying to see whether it should have a slightly different agenda. So this year it's got a really different agenda, and to make it more meaningful to people now as to when it got started, whenever Mary started with Michael.
I have to look it up. My brain is addled.
But it's been an operation, I don't know, this is officially the 18th year or something like that.
Well, at least the 18th.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you could, I guess, really I suppose it's probably the last question is just how, well, all right, I'm sorry, there are two. The first question is, since you've been here, in Randolph, I mean, have you been involved in sort of town and community affairs and things like that?
Oh, have I been involved in affairs?
I have to laugh. Of course he's been involved. Even that, he's always been for that, right?
Yes, I've been involved. I've been a volunteer for the American Red Cross for about 55 years, mostly in doing executive chores for them, running chapters as a volunteer and so forth. And I was corralled up here about 17 years ago to work on the Red Cross. And because somebody found out I had been doing it out in Chicago as a volunteer. And so I've been active in that, still am. At the age of 84, they're trying to retread me to be the chairman of this Central Vermont chapter and to oversee the possible merger of 3 chapters in the state. I've also been a member of the board of the I've got to leave you to go to a past trustees luncheon that starts at 12 o'clock. And I was also president of the local Chamber of Commerce and on its board for a number of years. I was actually at Beth Jacob for a while. I was on their board, and I think I was a vice president or something. And I've worked in organizing a non-for-profit corporation to deal with homeless situation here in the central Vermont area, which we got going so that we could help the local clergy deal with people who didn't have a place to live, although the situation usually fell in the hands of the ministers. Basically, I've been active. We've moved around a lot in my business undertakings, and what I found was that a good way to find your way into a community was to find out what the values of the community were and to see whether, where, or how any skills that I had could be useful. I believe not only Mary believes in, started me when we got married 8 years ago, on the fact that she was a tither, and so money-wise we were a tithing family for all the years we've been married. But I've also expanded that a little bit. So has she. We each try to give at least 200 hours a year of our discretionary time to community undertakings. And now that I'm retired, I give them even more hours than that, and so does she. And as we do this, we try to do it from a Jewish orientation, which we're right on the table with anybody that we're working with. We are Jewish, and we bring a Jewish view of the way we want to see the organizations that we're working with operate. in terms of the hospital. I was always an advocate of the fact that the hospital would take care of everybody who came, regardless of their ability to pay or whether they had insurance. That wasn't necessarily original with me. A lot of this is a very caring community, but I was comfortably able to be an advocate of that. Also believe strongly in Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and the things that and people know that I work from that frame of reference. I've been invited by several churches to speak about Tikkun Olam and my view of it in terms of why I involve myself in community affairs and why Mary does. And so it enables us, we think it's important to be involved, but to be involved with an orientation of why Jewish people do that and should do that. And so we find this a really good area to promote that view. We find that here in Central Vermont there's a great interest among the clergy about why Jews think the way they do. When my friend Rabbi Klein in Illinois was alive, many of the ministers in this area had direct pipeline to him and would discuss issues, Judaic issues, and he was an excellent scholar in the area of the New Testament, so they appreciated having somebody who could talk to them intelligently about that, about the New Testament and the Old Testament from a scholarly point of view. So we've used our time up here and our involvements up here to not only try to do some good things, but also to use it as a forum for promoting the knowledge of Jewish values and ethics and so forth. And we have participated in some interesting other undertakings. I was asked by a local minister if I would show her and any other of her interested people what it's like to study Torah. So every 2 weeks, we would have the Torah portion for that week and the previous week, and spend an hour and a half or 2 hours with the minister and or her whatever people she wanted to bring to and we kept it going for about 6 months until finally she had a baby and ran out of time about 3 or 4 months ago. But we've also participated, and we were invited to participate by a Baptist minister, a friend of ours, Jerry Smith, in the town. He was putting on a program called The Old Testament Made Simple. And he asked us, Mary and I, if we would participate in this 8-week class, an hour and a half a week.
Phil, I gotta interrupt. He didn't ask us.
We asked him.
I asked him.
Oh, you asked him?
I wanted to know how the Old
Oh, yeah,
Testament
she
made
wanted,
simple.
but he invited us to.
Yeah, he
He
said,
invited us.
Yeah, we could.
She had this discussion. She said, Jerry, how do you make the Old Testament simple? I want to know about that. So we participated in this program. And we were one of 2 classes he ran. He was oversubscribed for the first one, so we were the only Jewish people in either one of his classes. And when the thing was finished up, he said that, and other people told us that getting a Jewish view of the things that he had in his formal program was very helpful. He said it made this class that we were in different than the other class. Mm-hmm. But it's, the issue, there is a lot of anti-Semitism around. It's becoming, we don't sense it here, but on the other hand, every once in a while a letter about Israel gets into the local paper, and you get some interesting stuff.
It's, yeah.
Always misinformation.
I've learned not to be surprised. The other day, my son was, just in a very light-hearted way saying, I was talking to so-and-so at school, and I was telling him I was Jewish, and he said, oh, that's too bad, because you people killed Christ.
Yeah.
This is a third grader.
That's the same thing happened to me.
Why does a third grader hear this in this day and age?
I was telling Mary, when I was a little boy, I had a friend by the name of Edmund Sullivan, who was my closest friend. He lived 2 houses down from me. And one day I think I was about 7 or 8, and Edmund was about 7 or 8. And we got into an argument about something, and he rears back and he said, you're a bad person. You Jews killed the Lord. And I remember I went home and talked to my mother. I said, Edmund got angry with me, and he said, I killed the Lord. What is that? What was he talking about? But it was interesting. Your son heard the same thing I heard many years ago.
Yeah, I think he was pretty unfazed by it.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about it. So I guess the last question really grows out of what you've been talking about. Do you think there's something particular about rural New England, about Vermont, that for instance, that causes these ministers to be as open-minded as they are? I mean, is there something about rural New England that makes it hospitable to Jewish people?
I haven't got a big enough sampling. I mean, I've just operated in this area, and I don't know to what degree Mary and I, being a part of this community, has affected their attitude toward Judaism, because we've been eager to respect them and also eager to provide them with scholarly information at least once a year. Since our friend Rabbi Klein died, we bring in Rabbi Glazer from Burlington, who's the head Temple Sinai, to present a paper as a vehicle for discussion over a luncheon once a year. So they know that we're interested in having them have information about us, and to have a frank dialogue with a rabbi about issues like the last time the issue that was discussed was, this movie.
Oh, the
Mel Gibson's movie. Anyway, Rabbi Glazer came prepared before the movie was released to speak about, what was the subject of his talk? The Jewish view, a Jewish view of the Passion. And it was a frank discussion. He presented his views. They presented their views. And it was an interesting dialogue about the crucifixion and so forth. And I don't know how many communities, I'm not aware of any other community where this sort of thing is done. It may happen in Burlington or Rutland, I don't know. But
Montpelier has discussion groups.
yeah, at Montpelier may. But I think it's useful to have that go on. I think communities where it does go on gets a lot of stuff out on the table in a non-threatening way.
You forgot Chandler.
Oh, Mary, my list. I've been on the board of Chandler Cultural Foundation, where we bring artists into the community, music, and so on. I help get that back on an even keel and get it funded and run as a business and so on. Yeah, I did that.
The latest was the golf club.
Currently, I'm salvaging, redoing the fact that we have a local golf club here that got into financial trouble, so we're getting that turned around. I mean, these things, I do a lot of stuff that just sort of comes to me. But anyway.
Yeah, well, your 200 plus hours, I'm sure, are
Oh, it's a lot more than that.
taken care of.
Mary, you're up.
Well, I guess I'll ask you to start by, sort of where Bill started, which is to talk about family and grandparents and that kind of thing, where you grew up.
Well, I was born in 1922 in New York City, actually the Bronx, and my family moved, my mother and father moved out to what is now called Upper Westchester County in an old house.
What town?
Pound Ridge, New York. And the house needed a lot of work done. It was, built in 1777 or something like that. It was, anyway, that's where I started. It was definitely rural. And let's see, the Depression came along in 1929, and everything was upheaval. So my father lost his job, my mother, needless to say, lots of arguments and stuff. And so we had to give up that house, and we moved. My father, I don't know what he did, but my mother took the three of us, my brother, my sister, and I, to Nantucket for the winter, because I think she was doing a history of the family history. Needless to say, this is not a Jewish family history. And so we lived on Nantucket for a winter. Then we moved to Connecticut for the summer, and then she got a job working in a teaching school in Scarsdale, New York, and so that's where I went to high school.
Oh, you went to Scarsdale?
Yep.
I have 3 siblings that went there.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but it's a great school, actually. My brother was just down there last week for his reunion. I don't go back to reunions anymore, but anyway. From high school, I went to nursing school. From nursing school, I went to the Army. From the Army, I had an interesting life trying to I was supposed to be a replacement for the nurses in Italy. That war was over in Europe, so took us back to Indiantown Gap. Told me to get rid of all your stuff and give you stuff for the tropics, and then they sent me cross country to Hawaii, to California, and then to Hawaii. And that's where, because my name started with a B, first lieutenants, which I wasn't.
Oh yeah. Well, why don't you say what I don't know what your name was.
My name was Mary Bode, B-O-D-E, Bode. And so the first lieutenants and B through Fs stayed in the island. The rest went to the Philippines, and that's why I was in the Army just in Hawaii, which was a very nice place to be during the war. And then shortly after we got there, though, it was over, and then I met Bill. It's a long story, but anyway, I met Bill, and we got married. And where the Army is okay, but not necessarily the family okay. And that's that. Then that started our Army career. We left the Army, moved back to Connecticut, and our first daughter was born in Hawaii. It was nice. She was born in Hawaii. It wasn't a state then either. And in New Haven, we lived in a winterized cottage in Milford, Connecticut, which was terrible. It was cold. And we eventually bought a house in North Haven, Connecticut, and that's where the next two daughters were born in New Haven. Well, we lived in North Haven. And then we moved from North Haven to Indiana, where Bill got his job in the different job out in the West Coast, not out in the Midwest. And there's a lot went on in between all these things. Of course, I was getting used to his family. At that time, I had not converted to Judaism yet, but I've been thinking about it. And all I can say is that with his background and my background, and we met in the Army, and we were like two lost people, and we met each other, and we're like probably going to repair the world. I don't know. But anyway, because our families were impossible. And
You mean with each other? Just
oh, please, I don't even get along with each other. I mean, Bill's family was chaotic. His mother didn't get along with her brothers. Nobody got along. Of course, they all thought I was crazy. And, the whole family was fighting all the time. And anyway, I was glad to leave New Haven area to move to the Midwest. Bill had reservations, but he did anyway, because he could see it was not, life was just miserable. I mean, I don't even want to get into that. But he loved his grandfather, and his grandfather didn't think it was the wrong thing to do. So we moved. That's when we went to the Midwest.
I'll just go back for a minute to something else that you mentioned, that there was some family history on Nantucket. What was the family background? I'm just curious to hear.
Well, my mother, on my mother's side of the family, on her mother's side of the family, I believe it's her mother's side of the family, was Peter Folger, who came in 1638, and eventually, after living in Boston a little while and living in Rhode Island, I believe, a little bit, he finally settled in Nantucket, and I think he was a friend of Thomas Mayhew, who was settling in Martha's Vineyard, and he's considered the settler of Nantucket, and he actually was Benjamin Franklin's grandfather, I believe.
Folger was.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right. So on your mother's side, they go back.
On my mother's side. Yeah. Now on my mother's side, or side of the family, I don't know. I haven't had a time or inclination to go check it all out. But when my mother was born, she was born in Brooklyn, and her grandfather was the harbor master of Brooklyn Harbor, or New York Harbor or something. So I don't know. But her father came from Maine, and I think at one time he may have lived in Nantucket. His family may have been in Nantucket too. I'm not sure. And I personally don't have time to go check out all this out. What, it's any.
No, I'm mostly just curious what you grew up hearing about.
Well, I heard, like Maine was the big thing, and since I've been back to Maine, they lived in Skowhegan. My grandfather lived in Skowhegan, or a small town outside of Skowhegan, and the way they talked about going to Sydney and to going to Bangor, you'd think it was just over the hill around the corner, and it really isn't. And I'm amazed at the stories, when I get up there in the car trying to find these places. So it's they must have spent a lot of time on horseback or doing something. So, but my grandfather left Maine. He did not want to stay in Maine, and he left he was 14, I believe. And his father gave him $1 and said, "You're welcome to come back, but don't come back to live." And so what he did between the time he was 14 and the time that he married my grandmother in Brooklyn, I don't know what he did, except he must have done a lot. He learned 9 languages, or maybe, and he had his own business, and I really don't know what he did. I know he also took care of he was kind to his younger sister, or his sister, I don't know if she was younger or not, her husband was a veteran of the Civil War and had all kinds of problems. So, you know, but I don't really know what he did. But he became when he got married to my grandmother, they traveled a lot to Europe. He was in lace business and lace and importing lace.
You need to get your phone?
Susan!
27861.
Wait, my mother was 6 years old and she was one of 4 children. But she didn't know her older sister was 10 years older than she was, and there were 2 boys in between who had died of diphtheria epidemic in Brooklyn. And so then she was just a baby then when that happened. And so then she and her sister and her mother and father traveled in Europe a lot. So when she was school age, she did not know English as well as she should have or could have maybe. But she spoke Swedish, Italian, French, German, gobbledygook. So that's the story I heard about what a hard time she had when she went to public school because nobody could understand her because she had all different kinds. But anyway.
Now, all right, so the years went by and you were with Bill, and then at some point you decided to convert.
When we moved to the Midwest, I'd been brought up in a private school up until 6th grade. I forgot to mention that, which is, forget it for the moment. But anyway, I was not happy with the education that the children were getting, that my daughter was getting in Toledo. So I was reading, there was a Jewish day school, so that's how I enrolled her in the Jewish day school. And at that time, there was a new rabbi from England who was there, who was just coming there, and we became friendly with him. And when he discovered that I wasn't Jewish, he was horrified because not so much himself as the other rabbi that ran the school. You know, you're only supposed to have Jewish kids enrolled in the school, and here was somebody who was. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but I'd been thinking about Judaism. So for 6 months or so, Bill and I studied Judaism with him and getting ready to be converted because it really seemed to me the Judaism was the beginning, the Old Testament was the beginning of Christianity. If you don't understand the Old Testament and understand Judaism, so I figured I'll start at the beginning and learn, and that's where I am. I'm still learning, and I don't think I'll ever. No, I'm not going to convert back, of course, but Judaism, if it hadn't been for the Old Testament, the New Testament wouldn't have happened. So that's where we started. So the children got their Jewish education, and that rabbi moved on to Minneapolis, and we belonged to the Collingwood Avenue Temple, which is a Reformed congregation, and the children, the day school didn't go on. They only went to 3rd grade or something like that at that time, so that they went on back to public school and in Toledo. And then where else did we go from Toledo? We moved to Chicago. There again, just the public schools. But we always belonged to the Reformed congregations, and that's how I got started.
Now, had you been raised in a religious?
Well, my mother would have a fit if I said I wasn't.
Household?
No, not church going for sure. I think my mother would. My father was a German family, which I didn't mention my father's family, but they were also from New York, but they were a German and the Lutheran family. And my mother's family were Episcopalian, but my grandmother had switched to Christian Scientism around the 1890s when she was having such a hard time about her 2 boys being killed. The Christian Scientism had really been helpful to her, and my mother had no patience with religion. She did not. I don't know what she thought. I should have to come back and tell you what she thought, but we were not brought up in any particular way that I can think of. I'm trying to think. I guess my father definitely was not an atheist, but he didn't have much use. I guess they were the early hippies because they didn't have much use for organized religion, either one of them.
So you weren't. It's not as though you were converting from one faith
Oh,
to another
no.
faith. You were.
Well, my family would think so, but
in terms
but
of
I-
experience.
no,
you
I
don't
didn't think so.
feel that.
My brother and my sister belong to the Episcopalian Church, wherever they live right at this particular moment. And so, I don't know. I would say we were brought up in a Christian household, but they ran their own rules. Whatever.
Now, I guess we'll skip ahead then because I have an interest in all the Vermont
Yeah.
stuff. So, and in particular, that there was the question I was asking Bill, that he said to make sure to ask you about
The conference.
getting that conference started and how that all.
I'd almost have to. I don't know if I can drag it all up out of my brain right now, but I'll try to put it all together for you, because there's so much was going on. When I moved here to Vermont, Bill didn't mention it. I took care of my mother. I took care of my father from the time he was 78. My son was 8 years old. He was part of our family, and he was nuts. That's an awful thing to say. He was a very sweet man. My father aged gracefully, but so he was easier to get along with as an older person than my mother. Oh, just wears me out thinking about it, because with the 4 children and my father living with us, he had to share a room with my son, which wasn't bad. I mean,
an 8-year-old and
and
a
a
78-year-old.
Yeah. And, my father would teach him how to cheat at cards. He was, he just needed somebody to take care of him. And he was part of the family then. And, this is during the 60s. And our children are doing whatever they were doing, which was not what we appreciated. And they were involved in politics. Oh, please. Anyway, it was a rough time. As my husband said, we survived the growing up of the kids in their 60s. In the 60s, we survived that. And for a while, we were out of touch with our 2 older daughters. For 10 years, we didn't know what they were doing or where they were. And but now, thank goodness, it's all come full circle, so we're back together. We're close family now, but they were really doing their own thing. And it was during the we were in Chicago during the Democratic convention and all that. And the Haight-Ashbury and whole place. Anyway, they survived, we survived. And I also had my father living with us. We also have a tornado pulled the house apart. And what else happened? So when we moved to Vermont, I came with my father and my mother. Both of them needed help. One was put in the nursing home. The other one lived in the house with us until we got could get a room with the nursing home. I mean, this was all going on at the same time. And if it hadn't been for Judaism, I don't think I'd have survived. Somehow or other, I got strength from it all. And that's about it. I'd have to really sit down with my note with something and go through how things happened. But that's somehow or other I found time to. I think we belonged to the Mount Pelier Synagogue, and there was something called the Interfaith Interfaith Group or something, and that's how I started. I'm not sure what they thought they were, but what I thought they were an interfaith group. And it met a lot of the people, and it was a community. It was very helpful. I'm going to have to go back through my papers.
Yeah.
But I can't do it. I don't know how it works,
Right.
but my mother, my father, both eventually died here. And that was another, that's another thing. We have to deal with funerals and so forth. But we managed somehow or other. How I got mixed up with the conference, I'm trying to figure out. I think I'll have to go through the papers because whenever Michael started we started the conference. It sounded to me like a good idea because at that time there was no internet or no communications like conference calls and such, and there were so many Jewish people that were in the outskirts of the New England that it was a good time to get them together, and that's how it started.
And this is in the early 80s or something?
Yeah, very early 80s. No, I don't think it was the 70s. I think it was the early 80s because we didn't actually move here till 81. It's probably 82.
Yeah.
And I have all this information someplace, documented, sort of. And it was the time that R.D. Eno was active, and he ran whatever new magazine that communication he had. It was interesting, but I really.
Maybe I'll ask you one
Yes.
more question. Maybe you can just, from memory, just describe what you remember from some of those early conferences, particular things you remember happening.
I remember meeting people all over from Vermont, not just Vermont, from Maine, and we didn't have. Our children were not involved. It was our grandchildren, and I mean, who were now like 21 and 22. So, but I just remember it was the fact that we were having a networking between the Canadian border area, Derby, Plattsburgh, Maine, all these different Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and all these people would get together, and it made the weekend, because it was within financial means, it wasn't that all expensive, and it was a good time to get together with people, and just the sense of community was very. I know people in Burlington didn't come because they don't consider themselves rural, but but some of them did, of course. But mostly they don't. It wasn't the Burlington group as people as much as Montpelier and the outskirts of Maine, Bangor, all these different areas. And it seems to me we had some wonderful speakers. I don't remember. I don't know if you. I think Wolf Blitzer was one. Who's the man who runs Tico Malone, the magazine? Michael Lerner was another. Paul and Rachel Cohen, and a lot of other people too. But I don't remember. Those are the ones that stick out the most in my mind. But it was a great chance to meet and to learn from some of these people. It was fun. It was interesting.
Well, I'll